That day, I sat at the head of the mahogany table inside a private suite at an exclusive club in downtown Chicago, calmly watching the people I used to call family. The room was deathly quiet, a heavy silence that felt like the agonizing seconds right before an explosion. The central air gave off a faint hum, but the only thing I could truly hear was the steady, powerful beat of my own heart. My wife Eleanor's funeral had ended less than a week ago, and yet these vultures were already circling over my head. My daughter-in-law Claire leaned forward, placing her well-manicured hands flat on the polished wood. She didn't look like a grieving relative at all. Instead, she looked like a predator that had just cornered its exhausted prey. She slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the table, the sharp smack echoing through the quiet room. She gave a cold smile, her eyes filled with pure arrogance. "Now that the old lady is gone," she said, her voice dripping with a toxic smooth confidence, "you're going to transfer the trust assets under the company name to my daughter. Then you can take your pension and enjoy your retirement in Florida. Your time is up, Arthur. It's our turn to run the show." I turned to look at my son, Julian, who was sitting right next to her. He kept his head down, staring intensely at his expensive custom Italian leather shoes, too cowardly to even look his own father in the eye. They thought they had backed me completely into a corner. They naively assumed that a 68-year-old man, newly widowed and drowning in grief, would be an easy target to push around. But they completely forgot exactly who it was that built the multi-million-dollar commercial empire they were trying to steal, right out from under me in the concrete jungle of Chicago. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply smiled, folded my hands over my lap, and quietly waited. Exactly 3 seconds later, the heavy double doors of the private suite swung open. My personal financial and estate attorney, Evelyn Reed, marched into the room with absolute authority. Without saying a word, she walked straight to the table and dropped a notarized DNA test result directly in front of Claire. Before I tell you what was written on that piece of paper and how I completely dismantled the very people who tried to ruin my life, I want to take a step back to a few days ago to explain exactly how we reached this breaking point. It all started 4 days earlier. My house was still filled with the thick, suffocating scent of the white lilies from the funeral. My Eleanor was gone. 42 years of a beautiful marriage, ruthlessly cut short in just a single year by a sudden onset of early-stage Alzheimer's, followed by a massive stroke. This mansion in the Gold Coast neighborhood was now deafeningly quiet, and that empty space left a heavy physical ache in my chest. I stood alone at the kitchen sink, letting the warm water run over my hands as I mechanically washed a simple glass. It was mindless work, but as long as I kept my hands busy, my mind wouldn't wander back to the empty armchair in the living room. The marble countertop felt ice-cold against my touch. Eleanor had chosen that stone herself. She loved this kitchen more than any other room in the house, and now someone who never truly respected her was walking across her floors, shamelessly demanding the fruits of her life's work. Right then, I heard the sharp, hurried clicking of expensive heels against the hardwood floor. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. Claire strode confidently into the kitchen. There wasn't a single tear in her eyes, nor a trace of sorrow on her perfectly made-up face. Dressed in a sharp, tailored black designer pantsuit, she didn't look like she was mourning her mother-in-law. She looked like she was heading to Wall Street for a hostile corporate takeover, without offering a single word of comfort, or even bothering to ask how I was holding up after the hardest week of my life. She tossed a thick manila folder onto the countertop. The sound was loud and deliberate. I looked down at the folder. At the very top of the front page, printed in bold black letters, were the words, "Emergency Trust Takeover and Asset Succession Agreement." I shifted my gaze from the document back to Claire's face. "What is the meaning of this, Claire?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain completely steady and calm. She let out an exaggerated sigh, putting on a dramatic display as if she were dealing with a stubborn, unreasonable child. "This is for your own good, Arthur," she said smoothly, leaning back against the counter. "You're nearly 70 years old. You just lost Eleanor. You're drowning in grief, and your mental state right now simply isn't fit to keep running." Vance Realty Group. You need to sign this agreement today so we can smoothly transition executive control over to Chloe. Chloe was my 19-year-old granddaughter. She had barely scraped through private high school and spent almost all her time at equestrian clubs or showing off designer bags on social media. She couldn't even read a basic property balance sheet if her life depended on it. I stared at the legal document, feeling a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. Vance Realty Group wasn't just a company to me. It was the blood, sweat, and tears of my entire adult life. Back in the 1980s, Eleanor and I took the last few $1,000s in our bank account and started by buying a rundown duplex on the south side of Chicago. From there, we built a $60 million real estate development and property management empire. We didn't have wealthy investors. We only had each other and a shared dream. We used to sit in an unheated pickup truck during freezing winters, eating cold sandwiches while fighting tooth and nail for every municipal contract. Eleanor managed the books on a folding table, while I negotiated with contractors on the construction sites. And now, just 4 days after burying the woman who stood by my side to build everything from scratch, my daughter-in-law was demanding that I hand over the keys to a privileged teenager just so she could pull the strings from the shadows. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't show my anger. In business negotiations, the first person to lose their temper loses the game. I simply looked at her and said calmly, "The company is running perfectly fine. I am mourning, Claire, but I am not incapacitated." Right on cue, as if it had been rehearsed, my son Julian walked into the kitchen. He was 39 years old, but standing next to his overbearing and dominant wife, he looked like a terrified little boy waiting for orders. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on my shoulder, wearing a carefully practiced mask of deep concern. He was wearing a custom suit I paid for, living a luxurious life I fully funded, and playing the sophisticated gentleman at an art gallery I invested in. Yet here he was, before the dirt on his mother's grave had even dried, trying to force me out of my own home and company. "Dad, please, just listen to her this once," Julian said softly, his voice trembling slightly with just the right amount of emotion. "The doctors said your blood pressure has been dangerously high ever since Mom got sick. We're all so worried about you, and we can't afford to lose you too. Just sign these papers, put Chloe's name on the family trust, and Claire and I will handle all the daily operations of the company. You can finally get some proper rest and take care of yourself. You won't have to worry about a single thing anymore." It sounded incredibly caring, a completely flawless deception, a devoted son and a worried daughter-in-law, stepping up to lift the heavy burden off an old man's shoulders. But I knew Julian better than anyone. I spent millions of dollars sending him to an Ivy League university, only to watch him turn into a weak man, someone who couldn't even choose the color of his tie without his wife's explicit permission. I glanced at the expensive Montblanc gold pen that Claire had conveniently placed right next to the folder. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, taking a step back from the counter. "Before I sign anything, I need time to thoroughly read through the legal terms." Julian nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that I hadn't outright rejected their demands. "Of course, Dad, take all the time you need," he said, forcing a warm smile. "Just don't wait too long. The real estate market is highly volatile right now, and the company needs stable leadership." They turned and walked out of the kitchen side by side. Their footsteps faded down the long hallway, leaving me entirely alone with the heavy stack of documents. I stood frozen by the counter, my heart beating slowly and heavily in my chest. I slowly turned my head toward the large floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the hallway. The night sky had darkened the glass, turning it into a perfect mirror. In the reflection, I saw Claire pause near the front door. She pulled her phone from her designer handbag, and her fingers began flying across the screen. She had no idea that from where I was standing, I could see her reflection perfectly. I stared intently at her. I didn't even have to guess what she was doing, because the moment she hit send, a malicious, triumphant expression washed over her face, and she whispered quietly to herself. "The old man took the bait," she whispered to herself, sliding her phone back into her bag. "Get the board seats ready." I stood alone in the quiet, empty kitchen, listening to the slow drip of the faucet. They really thought I was a broken, senile old widower who would just roll over and give up. They believed they had outsmarted me on my own turf, but they were about to learn a brutal lesson. A lone wolf might lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth, and I was ready to bite back. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I had barely slept. Without Eleanor, the house felt completely suffocating, and the realization that my own family was plotting against me made the air feel even thinner. I needed the familiar routine of my empire to clear my head. I needed to stand in the lobby of Vance Realty Group and remind myself exactly who I was, not who I was to my greedy children, a fading man on his way out. By 6 in the morning, I had already parked in the executive lot. The biting morning wind cut across my face like a knife as I walked toward the towering glass skyscraper. This place was my sanctuary. I had poured my entire life into these walls. I walked through the quiet lobby, nodding to the night shift security guard, and took the private elevator straight to the top executive floor. Skipping my own office, I headed straight for the central archive room at the end of the hall. This room held the physical backups and deep digital encryption keys for every major financial transaction, trust document, and escrow account under Vance Realty Group. If Claire and Julian were planning a hostile takeover, they would inevitably have to alter those foundational agreements. I reached the heavy security door and pulled my master keycard from my pocket. I swiped the plastic card against the electronic reader, expecting the familiar green light and the mechanical click of the lock. Instead, the keypad let out a sharp, low whine. The indicator light flashed a hostile, solid red. Access denied. I stared at the glowing digital panel. My card was a top-tier master key, programmed never to expire and granted absolute clearance to every room in the building. I swiped it again. The reader buzzed a second time. Red light. Access denied. I pressed the card against the sensor a third time, pushing hard. Red. Complete lockout. Is there an issue with the lock, Arthur? The voice came out of the shadows near the lounge, incredibly loud in the quiet hallway. I slowly turned around. Stepping into the dim morning light was Marcus Thorne, our group's chief legal and acquisitions officer. He was in his mid-40s, wearing an immaculately tailored suit and wearing entirely too much expensive cologne. The heavy scent of musk and cedar hit me like a wave, turning my stomach. He walked toward me with a practiced, artificial smile. For 6 in the morning, he looked far too alert and comfortable. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and steady, "my master keycard seems to be malfunctioning. It's denying me access to the central archives." Marcus stopped a few feet away, slipping his manicured hands into his pockets. "Ah, right," he said, his smile widening just a fraction. "I should have informed you earlier. We're doing a massive system upgrade on the security servers this weekend. Julian ordered a complete overhaul of our digital access protocols to ensure our corporate data is absolutely secure. While the technicians migrate the files, the system is temporarily restricting access to all sensitive areas. Julian ordered it," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the empty hallway. Marcus nodded smoothly, completely unfazed. "Yes, Julian thought now was the perfect time to handle the security migration. He mentioned you'd be taking an extended leave of absence to mourn Eleanor, so he took the initiative to approve the upgrade. Nothing to worry about, Arthur. We have everything under control. You really should be home getting some rest." I looked straight into Marcus Thorne's eyes. They were cold, calculating, and filled with silent mockery. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that I knew. They were locking me out of my own company. They were building a digital fortress to cover up whatever financial manipulation they were currently pulling off, using my son as a convenient front. If I were the short-tempered Arthur of my younger years, I would have grabbed Marcus by his silk tie and thrown him out of the building. I would have ordered security to break down the door, but standing here now was a veteran of the business world. Making a scene would only give away my position. It would give them the perfect excuse to claim I was acting erratically out of grief, handing Claire the exact evidence she needed to prove I was mentally unfit to lead. "I won't argue with you, Marcus," I said smoothly, offering a polite nod. I suppose a security upgrade is long overdue? Tell Julian I appreciate his sudden interest in our data security. I turned my back on the chief legal officer and walked calmly toward my private office. I could feel his arrogant gaze burning into my back, but I didn't look back. I stepped inside my office, locking the heavy oak door behind me, and sat down in my leather executive chair. They thought cutting off my keycard would leave me blind. They thought controlling the modern servers meant controlling the information, but they fundamentally misunderstood how an old wolf protects his territory. I leaned down and pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk. I pressed my thumb against a biometric scanner hidden beneath the woodwork. A subtle click echoed through the quiet room, and a secret compartment slid open. Inside lay a slightly dusty old external hard drive, completely disconnected from the network. Next to it was a thick leather-bound paper ledger. I didn't entirely need their network access. 15 years ago, as a precaution against corporate espionage, I paid top dollar to a programmer to build a completely hidden backdoor into the core mainframe architecture. At the same time, I kept old-school bookkeeping habits, backing up all core fund movements through a private bank run by an old friend. I connected the heavy drive to my encrypted laptop. The screen flashed to life, prompting me for a sequence of complex encryption keys known only to me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Within seconds, I could bypass their pathetic firewall and uncover whatever corruption Claire and Marcus were hiding in my financial records. I took a deep breath, ready to fire the first shot in this silent war. But right before my finger could hit the enter key, the loud, intrusive ring of my personal phone shattered the silence. Startled, I pulled my hands back from the keyboard. Only a handful of people had this private number, and absolutely no one called it at 6:30 in the morning. I pulled the phone from my suit pocket and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID read Northwest Memorial Hospital. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Hospitals never call at dawn to deliver good news. I answered, bringing the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is this Mr. Arthur Vance?" a woman's voice asked. Her tone was professional, but carried an undeniable urgency. "This is the emergency department at Northwest Memorial. I'm calling regarding your granddaughter, Chloe Vance. She was involved in a severe accident during an early morning equestrian jumping session. The horse bolted, causing a serious fall and impact injuries. She is currently in the trauma ICU, and we need family here immediately." I slammed my laptop shut, shoving the encrypted hard drive back into the hidden compartment of the oak desk. The digital battle for Vance Realty Group would have to wait. My granddaughter was severely injured. Grabbing my car keys with a trembling hand, my heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I rushed out of my private office, completely ignoring the confused and annoyed look from Marcus in the hallway. I hit the elevator buttons, my mind flooded with terrible images of Chloe lying on the cold dirt of the arena. She was a spoiled teenager with too much money and too little common sense, but she was still my family. She was the only heir Eleanor had truly doted on during her final years. The drive to Northwest Memorial was a terrifying blur of flashing traffic lights, blaring horns, and aggressive lane changes. I broke every speed limit in the city, gripping the cold leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and my forearms ached from tension. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, silently praying I wouldn't be too late. I abandoned my car at the emergency drop-off zone, completely ignoring the parking restrictions, and pushed through the hospital's automatic glass doors. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the trauma ward stung my tired eyes. The air smelled heavily of industrial disinfectant and stale waiting room coffee. I spotted them immediately at the far end of the long, sterile hallway. Claire was pacing back and forth, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the polished linoleum. She was furiously typing on her smartphone, looking less like a devastated mother and more like someone deeply annoyed by a disruption to her schedule. Julian was slumped in an uncomfortable plastic waiting room chair, his head buried in his hands. His custom suit was completely wrinkled, and his broad shoulders trembled slightly under the bright hospital lights. I walked quickly down the hallway, the heavy thud of my shoes announcing my arrival. Julian looked up, His face was pale as a sheet, glistening with cold sweat. "Dad!" he choked out, standing up quickly and wiping his palms on his trousers. "I got here as fast as I could after the call," I said, grabbing his shaking shoulders. "What exactly happened? How bad is she?" Julian swallowed hard, shifting an anxious glance toward Claire. Claire finally stopped typing and looked at me, an expression of minor annoyance flashing across her face. "She was test riding a newly purchased Hanoverian warm blood," Julian explained, his voice noticeably trembling. The horse suddenly bolted and balked at a jump, throwing her hard into the rails. Thank goodness she was wearing a professional helmet and protective vest, so there's no severe head or spinal damage. But a splintered wooden rail pierced her abdomen, causing internal trauma and a ruptured spleen. She lost a lot of blood at the scene before the paramedics could get to her. Claire crossed her arms aggressively over her chest, letting out a sharp, deeply irritated sigh that echoed through the quiet corridor. "This is an absolute disaster, Arthur. We had everything perfectly scheduled to finalize the trust transfer documents this afternoon, and instead, we're stuck in this depressing waiting room." I stared at her, sickened by her complete lack of empathy. Her own daughter was on an operating table, fighting for her life, and all she cared about was her corporate takeover timeline. Before I could even reprimand her for her shocking coldness, the heavy double doors of the trauma unit swung open. A tired-looking attending physician stepped into the quiet waiting area. He wore blue scrubs, visibly dotted with fresh stains. His surgical mask was pulled down around his neck, revealing a lined, exhausted face. "Family of Chloe Vance?" he called out, his commanding voice echoing down the hospital corridor. We immediately stepped forward, forming a tense circle around the weary doctor. "She's medically stable for now," the doctor said, holding a thick metal clipboard and clicking his pen. "We managed to stop the primary internal bleeding, and her vitals are holding steady on the monitors. However, her hemoglobin levels are dropping to a critically low point. She seems to have an underlying autoimmune issue that affects her blood's ability to clot properly. We need to administer a massive transfusion immediately to prevent her from slipping into severe shock from blood loss." Julian let out a heavy sigh of relief, leaning against the wall for support. "Then give her the blood transfusion immediately," Claire ordered, waving a manicured hand impatiently at the doctor. "Give her whatever she needs and get her fixed up so we can leave this depressing place. We already have a luxury private recovery suite set up for her at home." The doctor frowned deeply, clearly repelled by Claire's demanding, arrogant tone. "It's not that simple, ma'am," he said, his professional voice turning firm and uncompromising. "Your daughter has a very specific blood type. She is O negative, but that isn't the main issue. The problem is, due to a massive multi-car pileup on the interstate last night, our blood bank's reserves of O negative and universal donor blood have experienced an unprecedented shortage. Our current inventory is simply insufficient to safely complete the required transfusion." He looked directly at Julian, then turned his stern gaze back to Claire. "We need immediate donations from direct relatives. This girl needs blood, and it has to enter her veins within the next hour for her to make a full recovery. We can take both of you to the lab right now for cross-matching to help save her." The world around me seemed to stop spinning entirely. The low mechanical hum of the hospital's ventilation system vanished. The rhythmic ticking of a distant heart monitor went dead silent in my ears. The doctor's words exploded in my mind, repeating over and over like a broken record. "She is O negative. The girl's O negative. Decades of analyzing complex corporate data had trained my mind to catch absolute factual inconsistencies instantly, and it immediately seized upon a massive, undeniable biological paradox. My wife Eleanor was blood type AB. I knew this with absolute certainty. I am type A. Therefore, my biological son Julian had, without question, inherited type AB. I was positive of this fact. I distinctly remembered all the medical paperwork from when he had emergency appendicitis surgery as a child. And Claire, as I had casually learned during a minor family medical scare years ago, was type A. I stood perfectly still in the sterile hospital corridor, staring blankly at the white wall directly behind the doctor. High school biology alarms began blaring deep inside my mind, An AB father and an A mother could naturally have children with blood types AB or AB, but under any imaginable scientific circumstance, it was absolutely impossible for them to produce a child with type O blood. Type O meant the child had to inherit a recessive O gene from both parents. Julian, being type AB, had no O gene to give. In that brightly lit hallway, a single, chilling, devastating conclusion stared right back at me. The girl lying on that operating table, the one I had doted on, spoiled, and prepared to hand my $60 million real estate empire to, did not have a single drop of Vance blood flowing through her veins. Chloe was not my biological granddaughter. I slowly turned my heavy head toward Claire. She was arguing fiercely with the exhausted doctor, loudly demanding that he call another private hospital to airlift the required blood via an emergency medical helicopter, regardless of the cost. She was putting on a loud, aggressive performance, deliberately deflecting from the urgent request for her own blood. She knew she couldn't donate, and a match test might raise even more questions about DNA. Then I shifted my cold gaze directly to my son. I expected to see a man confused by basic genetics. I expected to see an anxious, grieving father questioning if the lab had made a mistake with the paperwork. Instead, what I saw sent a shiver down my spine and broke my heart into 1,000 sharp pieces. Julian was leaning heavily against the painted hospital wall, his hands gripping the metal railing so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He wasn't looking at the frustrated doctor, nor at his shouting wife, Claire. He was staring intently at the linoleum floor, his entire frame trembling beneath his expensive suit. He was sweating profusely, heavy drops rolling down his pale forehead. He wasn't confused by the science. He was terrified. He knew. He absolutely, undeniably knew that the genetic math didn't add up. When he finally found the courage to lift his heavy head, he felt my burning, piercing gaze locked onto him. For a terrifying fraction of a second, our eyes met in that sterile corridor. He saw the cold, sharp realization hardening across my face. He knew that I had done the genetic math in my head and arrived at the truth. Julian immediately broke eye contact, turning his head completely away, unable to face the father he was actively helping to betray. The dead silence in the sterile hallway was finally broken when Claire pulled out her platinum credit card. She aggressively thrust it toward the exhausted attending physician, demanding he contact a nearby private medical facility to secure the blood via emergency helicopter transport, no matter how high the financial cost. Recognizing he was dealing with individuals who believed money could easily bend reality, the doctor gave a cold nod and strode back through the heavy doors to make the necessary arrangements. With the immediate medical crisis temporarily managed by Claire's aggressive financial intervention, a suffocating tension settled over the three of us. We were no longer a family waiting for a routine medical update. We were a family standing on a massive foundation of carefully constructed lies, and that foundation had just suffered a catastrophic structural fracture. I didn't call them out right there in the open corridor. Decades in ruthless business negotiations had taught me a vital lesson. Cornering a panicked animal in a completely public space is a massive tactical error. Instead, I let the stifling silence stretch on for a few agonizing minutes. Looking at Julian, who still steadfastly refused to make eye contact with me, I calmly suggested we go downstairs to the hospital cafeteria for a coffee while we waited for the helicopter transport. He hesitated, his anxious eyes darting to his wife for silent permission. Claire, now fully distracted by another incoming text on her smartphone, waved her hand impatiently for him to go. She clearly wanted space to manage her own affairs without my micro-scrutiny. Julian swallowed hard, gave a weak nod, and followed submissively behind me as we walked toward the elevators. The hospital cafeteria was a bleak, depressing cavern located in the basement of the massive building. Harsh, flickering fluorescent lights reflected poorly off the cheap linoleum floors, casting a sickly yellow hue over scattered plastic tables. The smell of burnt coffee and harsh industrial bleach hung heavy in the stale, recycled air. We bought 2 cups of bitter, lukewarm coffee in disposable foam cups and took a seat at a secluded table in the furthest corner of the empty room. Julian sat across from me, his hands tightly gripping his cup as if the cheap foam was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. His broad shoulders slumped, and his expensive suit jacket hung loosely over his defeated frame. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the terrible coffee, letting the bitter taste wash over my tongue. I set the cup down and looked straight across the narrow plastic table. "So," I began, keeping my voice incredibly calm, measured, and entirely free of accusation. "That was quite a tense situation upstairs with the doctor. I suppose it's a good thing Claire is willing to cover the cost of the emergency transport. But I must admit, Julian, I'm a bit confused by the medical details. The doctor was very clear that Chloe is O-negative. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the slightly sticky plastic surface. Your mother, Eleanor, was blood type AB. I am type A. You are without a doubt type AB, and Claire is type A. How exactly does a child from those biological parents miraculously end up with O-negative blood?" Julian recoiled violently, his reaction so sudden it looked as though I had reached across the table and struck him across the face. The cold sweat that had started to dry on his forehead broke out all over again, forming tiny, glistening beads. He was gripping his foam cup so tightly that the scalding coffee nearly spilled over the flimsy brim. He did not look confused. There was none of the genuine, natural bewilderment you would expect if a laboratory had truly made a mistake. Instead, he erupted with sudden, explosive hostility. He slammed the cup down onto the table, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate, and defensive anger. "You are letting grief cloud your judgment, Dad," he snapped back, his face turning a deep, furious red. The lab obviously made a simple typo on her medical chart. Things like that happen all the time in a chaotic emergency room. Please do not start one of your paranoid interrogations today. My daughter is lying in a hospital bed, and you are trying to turn a basic clerical error into some ridiculous conspiracy theory. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full weight of his outburst. In my decades of cutthroat real estate acquisitions and corporate restructuring, I had sat across negotiation tables from hundreds of desperate people trying to cover up ugly truths. I knew exactly what real confusion looked like. I knew what righteous indignation felt like, and I knew exactly how a cornered, guilty coward behaved when the walls of their own lies started closing in. Julian was not stupid, but he was an incredibly poor liar. He was hiding something massive, and his sudden, unprovoked aggression completely confirmed my worst fears. If he truly believed it was just a lab error, he would have given a tired sigh and brushed the question aside. He would have gently reminded me that paperwork mistakes happen. Instead, he attacked. He weaponized our fresh grief over losing Eleanor, just to deflect a perfectly logical question about biology. As I stared at the sweating, defensive man sitting across from me, a deep, heavy sorrow washed over my soul. This was my son. This was the boy I had worked 80 hours a week to provide for. Decades ago, Eleanor and I used to sit in a freezing pickup truck, eating cold sandwiches, pouring everything we had into building the Vance Realty Group from the ground up. We dreamed of the future we could give this boy. We poured millions of dollars into his elite, privileged upbringing. We paid for the finest private boarding schools, lavish summer trips, and an Ivy League education. We handed him every single advantage we never had, hoping to forge a strong, intelligent leader who could carry our empire into the next generation. But all that money, all that privilege, and all those expensive schools had ultimately produced an incredibly weak follower. Julian did not return from that elite university as a leader. He came back as a man whose internal compass was completely broken. He was someone who always chose the path of least resistance, someone who would always submit to the strongest personality in any room. And unfortunately for everyone involved, the strongest personality he ever encountered was his manipulative, fiercely ambitious wife, Claire. Claire realized very early on just how easily he could be molded. Over the past 20 years, she had meticulously shaped him into an obedient, silent accessory to her own grand, greedy ambitions. He was not a partner in his own marriage. He was like an overgrown hostage who had slowly fallen in love with his captor, I let the tense silence stretch out between us, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to give him an easy way out. "You might be right, Julian," I finally said, my voice low and cold. It must have been a typo. After all, what other possible explanation could there be? I chose every single word deliberately, leaving an unmistakable, unspoken warning hanging in the air. Julian swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat moving visibly against his collar. He quickly looked away, completely unable to hold my gaze under the crushing weight of my scrutiny. He muttered a vague word of agreement, staring blankly at the swirling dark liquid in his cup. He knew that I knew, and he knew he was completely powerless to stop the storm that was rapidly gathering on the horizon. I rose slowly from the cheap plastic chair, leaving my untouched coffee on the table. "Take a moment to collect yourself, son," I said, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, measured movements. "I'm going upstairs to check on when the medical helicopter will be arriving." I did not wait for him to answer. I turned and walked away, leaving him entirely alone in that depressing, fluorescent-lit basement to drown in the weight of his own guilt. I rode the slow, rumbling elevator back up to the trauma floor. My mind was racing, running through thousands of complex scenarios, calculating every variable, and mapping out my legal and financial countermeasures. When the elevator doors slid open on the surgical floor, I stepped out into the quiet corridor. I did not walk straight back to the waiting area. Instead, I stopped behind a thick concrete pillar near the nurse's station, keeping myself completely hidden in the shadows. Further down the long, sterile hallway, standing by the massive glass windows that overlooked the bustling city streets below, was Claire. She was pacing back and forth with extreme agitation, whispering furiously into her smartphone in a tense, hushed tone. It absolutely was not a lab typo. Chloe was definitely not a biological Vance. I desperately needed irrefutable proof, and I knew exactly how to get it. Shortly after Claire finished her frantic phone calls, the emergency helicopter arrived. The medical procedures were completely successful. Chloe's vital signs quickly stabilized, and within a few hours, the attending physician declared her out of danger. By early evening, the hospital cleared her for discharge, providing pain relief medication and strict orders for bed rest. I played the role of a relieved grandfather to absolute perfection. I embraced Julian, gave Claire a supportive smile, and told them I would stop by to check on them later. Then I went home to prepare for a very different kind of operation. I needed undeniable evidence, and I had to secure it before they realized I had already seen right through their deception. I stopped by a high-end deli and purchased 2 large containers of chicken soup, transferring them into my own premium glass containers at home to make it look like a comforting homemade gesture. Before leaving, I slipped a pair of latex gloves and 3 sterile, resealable plastic bags into my wool coat pocket. The sun had completely set by the time I pulled into their driveway. It was a multi-million-dollar estate in Lincoln Park, featuring a perfectly manicured lawn and a grand stone facade, all completely paid for with my money. 3 years ago, wanting to provide a stable environment for the girl I mistakenly believed was my own flesh and blood, I signed the check for the massive down payment. Now, looking at the warm light glowing through the windows, I felt nothing but a profound sense of betrayal. I walked up the stone steps and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Julian opened the door. He looked utterly exhausted, still wearing the same wrinkled suit from the hospital. "Dad," he said, a hint of anxiety creeping into his voice, "you really didn't need to make the trip out here tonight. You should be resting." I held up the glass containers, offering a gentle smile. "I couldn't sleep, son," I said softly. "I know you two must be exhausted. I brought over some hot soup so you wouldn't have to worry about dinner." Julian stepped aside, letting me into the grand foyer. The house was dead silent, the thick, luxurious carpeting absorbing the sound of my heavy footsteps. We walked into the kitchen. Claire was sitting at the marble island, holding a glass of red wine in one hand and a stack of hospital discharge papers in the other. She made absolutely no effort to stand up and greet me. Instead, she immediately began complaining loudly about the cost of the emergency medical helicopter, which she herself had insistently demanded just hours prior. "Can you believe the nerve of these private medical transport companies?" she scoffed. tossing a billing statement onto the counter. For a 20-minute helicopter ride, they are charging us an absolute fortune. It is downright criminal. I set the soup down on the counter, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Health and safety are priceless, Claire, I replied smoothly. We are just incredibly fortunate that Chloe is upstairs resting comfortably right now. She rolled her eyes and took another sip of her wine, completely missing the double meaning hidden in my words. Julian offered to heat up the soup, stepping away toward the kitchen stove. I seized the perfect opportunity. I am going to wash my hands and check on the little one, I said in a completely casual tone. Before either of them could raise an objection, I turned and left the kitchen. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating with a cold, precise rhythm. The second floor was dimly lit and quiet. I bypassed the master bedroom and headed straight down the long hallway toward Chloe's private suite. I cracked her bedroom door open just a tiny fraction. She was fast asleep in her large bed, resting under a mountain of blankets with a pair of noise-canceling headphones over her ears. I silently pulled the door shut and slipped directly into her attached private bathroom. The room smelled of expensive perfume and mint toothpaste. Reaching into my coat pocket, I pulled out the sterile plastic bags and the surgical latex gloves. I snapped the gloves onto my hands, my movements carrying the silent efficiency of a man completely focused on a mission. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet above the ceramic sink. There, resting in a sleek metal holder, was her blue electric toothbrush. The bristles were still slightly damp from recent use. It was a perfect, uncontaminated source of genetic material. I carefully pulled the toothbrush out, ensuring I never touched the head of the brush, and dropped it directly into the first sterile plastic bag. I sealed the airtight strip, locked the evidence deep in my pocket, and closed the cabinet without making a single sound. Half the battle was won. Now I needed a sample from Julian. I took off the latex gloves, slipped out of the bathroom, and quietly retraced my steps back down the carpeted hallway. But instead of heading straight back to the kitchen, I took a sharp turn toward the large laundry and mudroom that connected to the spacious garage. Julian was a creature of absolute habit. He went to an executive gym 3 times a week, and he always threw his used workout gear into a specific wicker hamper by the garage door, far too lazy to actually put them into the washing machine himself. I stepped into the dimly lit mudroom, my eyes scanning the organized shelves and hooks. I spotted the wicker basket immediately. Piled right at the very top was his dark gray workout jacket, tossed there right before the medical emergency completely disrupted their entire weekend plan the previous afternoon. I put on a fresh pair of surgical gloves, picked up the dark garment, and held it up against the dim security light filtering through the garage window. I examined the collar and the inner lining with intense focus. It took me less than 30 seconds to find what I was looking for. Woven into the fabric near the neckline, right where the material would press against his skin, were 2 clear strands of dark brown hair. I pulled a small pair of metal tweezers from my pocket, gripped the very tips of the hairs, and carefully pulled them free from the jacket lining. I held them up to the light, confirming that the tiny white biological roots were still perfectly intact. It was more than enough biological material for a definitive match. I tossed those 2 strands of hair into the second sterile plastic bag, sealed it tight, and tucked it safely into my coat pocket, along with the toothbrush. I pulled off the latex gloves, smoothed out the wrinkles in my coat, and walked back into the kitchen, pretending nothing had happened. Julian was pouring the hot soup into ceramic bowls. I offered a warm smile and played the part of the tired, relieved grandfather for another 10 minutes. Then I gracefully excused myself, blaming my old bones for needing rest after such an emotionally draining day. They watched me walk out the front door, completely unaware that I was walking away with the devastating proof needed to dismantle their carefully constructed world. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove out of their pristine, upscale neighborhood. But I did not head to my empty house. I pulled onto the dark interstate and pressed down on the gas. I drove through the night, through the darkness, to a private genetics lab 2 towns over. I had contacted them via a high-level emergency line while I was driving to arrange a strictly confidential after-hours appointment. Just past 2 in the morning, I arrived at the low-key, unmarked medical building. A stern-faced lab technician in a white coat let me in through a heavy, glass-reinforced security door. I handed him the 2 perfectly sealed plastic bags and a thick envelope containing $5,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. I requested an expedited, high-priority analysis. The young technician counted the money carefully, marked the bags with random numerical barcodes to ensure total anonymity, and assured me I would have legally binding results within 48 hours. A short time later, I walked out of the private clinic. The first purple light of dawn was breaking on the eastern horizon. The biting morning cold whipped against my face, but I felt a strange, burning heat radiating from deep within my chest. I had obtained and submitted the biological evidence. The hammer of science had officially been swung. I unlocked my car door, slid into the cold leather driver's seat, and let out a long, heavy breath. I reached into my pocket for the car keys, but my fingers brushed against my smartphone instead. The screen suddenly lit up in the dim car interior, vibrating violently in my palm. It was an automatic security alert triggered by a secret digital backdoor I had programmed into the Vance Realty Group servers over a decade ago. I stared at the blinking text on the screen, feeling the blood in my veins turn to ice. Someone inside the company was attempting to authorize an unapproved, massive wire transfer of $6 million. And they were desperately trying to forge my personal digital signature to push the transaction through. I slammed the car into gear and roared out of the clinic parking lot. The sun had fully risen now, painting the morning sky in vibrant shades of orange and gold. But in my world, it had never felt colder or darker. My mind was moving faster than the engine. Whatever bastard was sitting at a computer terminal trying to force this massive wire transfer through the Vance systems was clearly feeling desperate. They were trying to bypass the primary authentication protocols by using a forged credential package that mimicked my digital footprint. I did not drive back to the corporate headquarters. Confronting Marcus, or whoever else was sitting at that desk right now, would only give them a chance to wipe the servers and destroy the records before I could get the digital evidence. I drove straight back to my large, empty house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. I bypassed the kitchen and walked down the long hallway toward my private home office. I locked the heavy door behind me and pulled the thick wooden blinds shut, plunging the room into a deep shadow. I turned on the desk lamp and sat down at my secure home terminal. 15 years ago, when Vance Realty was expanding rapidly and we were fending off corporate espionage from rival firms, I hired a genius independent programmer to build an insurance mechanism into our network architecture. It was a digital ghost, a completely invisible backdoor, coded directly into the core framework of the company's servers. I never told Eleanor about it, and I certainly never told Julian or the board of directors. It was my ultimate insurance policy, designed specifically for a catastrophic disaster like the one unfolding today. I booted up the terminal and typed in a complex string of command codes that hadn't been used in a decade. The screen flickered black, then poured out lines of green code like a waterfall. I was in. I moved through the invisible pathways of the network, silently bypassing those heavily touted corporate firewalls, without triggering a single alarm. I locked on to the active terminal that had triggered the security alert. The terminal was registered to the executive legal suite. Marcus Thorne was already awake and working overtime, and he was frantically trying to force a heavily encrypted wire transfer through the system, using a deceptive credential package designed to mimic my authorization. I watched his keystrokes in real time, like a ghost watching a clumsy thief trying to pick a lock. Marcus was a smooth, calculating veteran of legal mergers, but his understanding of deep network architecture was arrogant and fundamentally flawed. He had set up a series of internal locks, trying to block standard admin access for the regular finance staff, and for me. But his walls were only built on the surface. He had no idea I was swimming beneath the foundation of his digital fortress. With a few precise keystrokes, I isolated his transfer request and quietly quarantined the transaction, leaving that $6 million hanging in a hidden digital purgatory. There, he could neither complete the transfer nor delete the trail of his attempted theft. I had him perfectly trapped. My heart pounded with a mix of rage and intense focus, and I prepared to dig deeper into the system. I needed to see exactly how long this disease had been spreading through my company, and I needed to gather every single piece of irrefutable evidence before they realized they had been caught. After blocking the immediate financial hemorrhage, I turned my attention to the root of the rot. I needed to see how deep the infection went. I tracked the destination of the intercepted wire transfer, following the complex routing numbers through a dizzying maze of offshore agreements and disguised corporate entities. What I found was an incredibly sophisticated, highly organized maze of financial fraud. Marcus was not just skimming off the top. He had meticulously planned a massive, systematic pipeline designed to drain the blood from my company. I uncovered 4 different shell companies, all recently registered in Delaware under fake LLC names. Their names were all generic, meaningless words that could blend perfectly into standard project expense reports. Peak Construction Solutions, Apex Property Consulting, Horizon Management Partners, and Zenith Supply Chain Associates. I opened the accounting ledgers connected to these ghost companies. The digital paper trail revealed an endless series of fabricated invoices, ghost consulting services for structural upgrades that never happened, non-existent software licenses, and fake maintenance routes that Vance Group supposedly outsourced. The volume of fake invoices was staggering, but they were carefully calculated, with amounts that slid just under the threshold to trigger automatic secondary reviews by the board of directors. Marcus had precisely arranged these payments to look exactly like standard project operating expenses, hiding the theft perfectly behind walls of tedious corporate bureaucracy. I began downloading every ledger, every fake invoice, and every routing number onto my secure hard drive, ensuring I had a permanent, unalterable record of their massive criminal enterprise. The depth of the deception was sickening. It revealed a calculated greed that shattered any remaining illusions I held about the people operating within my own corporate headquarters. I kept digging, comparing the dates of the fake invoices with the dates of the company's capital outflows. I pulled up the company's general ledger and cross-referenced the missing funds with our internal accounts. When the numbers finally aligned on the glowing screen, a wave of intense nausea hit me so hard I had to grab the edge of the desk just to stay upright. This money wasn't coming from our daily operating revenue. It wasn't coming from our expansion reserves. Over the past 8 months, the $6 million that Marcus and Claire had systematically siphoned off was pulled directly from escrow accounts, reserved for a pending $40 million downtown commercial building deal, and the long-standing employee major repair funds. They even dipped into a portion of the supplemental pension plan reserved for senior staff. These bastards were stealing the blood and sweat of the truck drivers, property managers, and maintenance coordinators, the very people who had fought side by side with me to build this company. And the worst part was the timeline. I stared at the dates of the largest outgoing wire transfers, feeling a sharp, twisted pain in my chest. The first massive withdrawal had been initiated 8 months ago. That was the exact same week that Eleanor received notice that her Alzheimer's had accelerated into a stroke. While I was pacing back and forth in a sterile oncology waiting room, holding my dying wife's fragile hand and crying at her bedside, my daughter-in-law and my chief legal officer were busy looting the company treasury. They knew I was completely distracted by grief and medical decisions. They knew my entire world was focused on the woman I loved more than life itself. They weaponized my agony, using Eleanor's tragic decline as the perfect, long-term shield to plan their massive theft. Every time Claire visited the hospice center, she was calculating how much more money she could steal. Money that eventually turned into the bricks and mortar of a luxury vineyard she bought in her name in Napa Valley. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the glow from the computer monitor illuminating the dim room. The pieces of the puzzle finally snapped together with a chilling clarity. The massive embezzlement of escrow and pension funds, the fake shell companies in Delaware, the desperate attempt at dawn to force a transfer using my forged digital signature, and the aggressive way they pushed me to sign the succession agreement just 4 days after Eleanor's funeral. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder that Claire had slammed onto my kitchen counter yesterday. The Emergency Trust Takeover and Asset Succession Agreement. I flipped past the first few pages of administrative jargon and skipped straight to the final clauses buried at the very end of that long, tedious document. And there it was, hidden beneath layer after layer of dense corporate legalese, a comprehensive liability waiver that completely cleared the incoming executive board of any past financial discrepancies, along with a mandatory directive authorizing the upcoming end-of-year audit. The signature line, as the sole authorizing party, required my name. This transfer document was never about a simple transition of power. It wasn't just because Claire wanted to pull the strings from behind the scenes. The document was a meticulously crafted legal shield. The end-of-year corporate audit was scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks. The independent auditing firm would tear through the company's ledgers, and it wouldn't take them an hour to discover the massive $6 million black hole in the escrow accounts and employee funds. When federal investigators inevitably stepped in and combed through the wreckage, they would demand answers. They would look at the digital authorization logs, and they would see my digital signature on those forged credentials. If I signed this transfer document, I would be legally validating every single financial transaction that took place prior to the handover. Claire and Marcus weren't just stealing my money. They were setting me up to take the fall for the entire operation. They intended to use my signature to bury this massive embezzlement scheme completely under my name. They needed my signature to seal my fate, and they didn't hesitate for a second to weaponize my grief to get it. Unfortunately for them, they severely underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. The hours following my discovery in the digital shadows of Vance Realty Group dragged on with suffocating slowness. I had paralyzed Marcus Thorne's desperate attempt to move that $6 million, freezing the stolen funds in a digital limbo. But that was just the financial front. The biological battle was still raging silently, waiting for science to deliver its irrefutable verdict. I locked myself in my dim home office for 2 solid days. I ignored the endless calls from Julian, whose anxiety was clearly skyrocketing over my delay in signing the agreement. I ignored the aggressive text messages from Claire, who was likely wondering why her perfect trap hadn't snapped shut yet. I needed absolute silence. Any reaction before every single piece of the puzzle was locked into place would be a catastrophic mistake. I drank bitter black coffee and stared at the wall, my mind breaking the betrayal down into manageable, actionable steps. Finally, on the 3rd morning, the secure secondary phone on my desk vibrated violently. It was a local number, the private genetics lab I had visited under the cover of night. I answered immediately, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Vance, a professional," detached voice said through the speaker. "We have completed the expedited analysis of the biological samples you provided. The comprehensive results have been compiled, verified, and sealed. They are ready for physical pickup at our front desk at your earliest convenience." I didn't ask for the results over the phone. I needed to hold that physical document in my hands. I thanked the technician, hung up, and grabbed my heavy wool coat. The final nail for my family's betrayal was waiting for me. The bright morning sun made the drive to the private clinic feel entirely different. When I had driven this same route 3 nights ago, I was a man driven by desperate, manic suspicion. Now I was an executioner, walking toward an inevitable conclusion. I parked my Lincoln Navigator in the clinic's unmarked lot and stepped into the crisp autumn air. The cold, sterile white walls of the lobby offered no comfort. I walked up to the reception desk and provided the anonymous numerical barcodes assigned to my plastic bags. The receptionist was a young woman who seemed far too cheerful for a place that regularly delivered life-altering news. She pulled up the file on her terminal and retrieved a thick, tamper-proof manila envelope from a locked cabinet. She slid it across the counter, completely unaware of the absolute destruction sealed inside those paper walls. I took the envelope, feeling its physical weight in my hands. I didn't open it in the lobby. I needed the absolute privacy of my own space. I walked out through the automatic glass doors, the mechanical hum sounding incredibly artificial in my ears. I climbed into the driver's seat of my SUV, shutting out the world as the heavy doors locked. I started the engine, letting its low, rhythmic rumble fill the insulated cabin. The heater blew warm air over my cold hands, but it did nothing to melt the ice that had formed in my chest. I sat in the idling vehicle for a long time, staring at the blank surface of the envelope on the passenger seat. Inside that paper casing was the absolute scientific truth of my bloodline. I had spent 19 years looking at Chloe, searching her teenage face for traces of my own features, looking for Eleanor's bright smile in her expressions, and trying to find my own relentless drive in her behavior. Now I was about to find out that I had been searching for ghosts all along. I took a deep, steady breath, reached over and picked up the envelope. Sliding my index finger under the sealed flap, I tore it open in one clean, decisive motion. I pulled out the crisp, white lab report. The pages were dense with complex genetic markers, biological sequencing charts, and professional medical terminology. But I skipped past the complicated data, letting my eyes drop directly to the bold, capitalized conclusion printed clearly at the bottom of the final page. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The biological sample provided by subject A shares no paternal genetic relationship with the biological sample provided by subject B. The subject known as Chloe is excluded as the biological offspring of the subject known as Julian. I read the number again. 0.00%. No margin of error. No statistical anomaly. A total, undeniable biological zero. The teenager I had loved, spoiled, and prepared to inherit my massive real estate empire was an absolute stranger. She didn't carry a single drop of Vance's blood. Eleanor's sacred lineage, the family legacy we had fought so hard to protect, had ended the exact moment my wife took her last breath in that hospice bed. For a full minute, a deep, overwhelming wave of sorrow washed over me. I mourned the loss of my grandchild. I mourned the absolute deception that had stripped me of my true legacy. I grieved for Eleanor, but I was also grateful to whatever higher power existed that she had passed away before having to witness this sickening betrayal. But the grief didn't last long. It was burned away almost instantly, incinerated by a cold, calculating, and terrifying rage. The sorrow was entirely consumed by the sharp, hyper-focused clarity of a man who just realized he was surrounded by vicious predators. I folded the lab report perfectly and placed it securely in the inside pocket of my tailored suit. My mind, trained by decades of brutal corporate warfare, began rapidly processing the new variables on the battlefield. If Julian wasn't the girl's biological father, then who was? Claire was a highly calculating, fiercely ambitious, former corporate consultant. She would never risk her incredibly comfortable, heavily subsidized lifestyle as a wealthy socialite for a meaningless fling with a stranger. If she was going to betray a highly lucrative marriage to the heir of a real estate empire, she would have engaged with someone useful, someone who could actively help her achieve her ultimate goal of absolute financial control over the trust assets. She would partner with someone who knew exactly how to manipulate massive sums of money without triggering internal alarms within the company. She would partner with someone who had deep, unrestricted access to the incredibly complex financial and legal architecture of the Vance Realty Group. The realization hit me like a speeding freight train. The missing $6 million from the escrow accounts, the fake shell companies registered in Delaware, the desperate attempt at dawn to force a massive wire transfer through the system using my forged digital signature. Claire wasn't operating alone to plan this massive corporate embezzlement. She had a highly skilled, deeply embedded partner on the inside. I pulled my car out of the medical clinic's parking lot, my destination firmly locked in. I didn't go back to the office, and I didn't go home. I was going to war, and I needed a soldier to gather my ammunition. I drove to an unremarkable office building in an industrial park on the edge of the city. I pushed open the door and stepped into the modest, utilitarian office of David Sterling. David was a former high-level IRS special agent, a man who had spent 20 years tracking white-collar criminals and dismantling organized syndicates. Afterward, he transitioned into highly lucrative, strictly confidential private investigation. For the right price, he was ruthless, incredibly efficient, and completely devoid of moral hesitation. I slid those 2 strands of hair into the second sterile plastic bag, sealed it tight, and placed it safely alongside the toothbrush in my coat pocket. Peeling off my gloves, I smoothed out the wrinkles in my coat and walked back into the spacious kitchen, looking completely unbothered. Julian was busy pouring the freshly heated soup into ceramic bowls. I offered a warm smile, fully leaning into the role of the exhausted yet deeply grateful grandfather for another 10 minutes. Then I gracefully took my leave, using the excuse that my old bones were catching up with me after such a long, emotionally draining day. They watched me walk out the front door, totally oblivious to the fact that I was leaving with the exact pieces of devastating evidence needed to bring their entire carefully constructed world crashing down. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove out of their pristine, upscale suburban neighborhood. But I didn't head home to my empty house. Instead, I merged onto the pitch-black interstate and pressed hard on the gas, driving through the night toward a private genetics lab 2 towns away. I had contacted them on a high-level emergency line during the drive to set up a strictly confidential after-hours appointment. Just past 2 in the morning, I arrived at the low-key, unmarked medical building. A serious-faced lab technician in a white coat let me through the heavy glass security doors. I handed him the 2 perfectly sealed plastic bags, along with a thick envelope containing $5,000 in crisp, untraceable cash, requesting an expedited top-priority analysis. The young technician counted the money carefully, labeled the bags with random numerical barcodes to ensure complete anonymity, and promised I would have legally binding results within 48 hours. A short time later, I stepped back outside the private clinic. The first purple streaks of dawn were breaking on the eastern horizon. The biting morning chill whipped against my face, but I felt a strange, burning heat radiating from deep within my chest. I had successfully secured and submitted the biological evidence. The hammer of science was officially in motion. I unlocked my SUV, slid into the cold leather driver's seat, and let out a long, heavy breath. Reaching into my pocket for the keys, my fingers brushed against my smartphone instead. The screen suddenly lit up in the dim cabin, vibrating aggressively in my palm. It was an automatic security alert, triggered by a secret digital backdoor I had personally coded into the Vance Realty Group servers over a decade ago. Staring at the blinking text on the screen, the blood in my veins instantly turned to ice. Someone within the company was trying to authorize a massive, unapproved wire transfer of $6 million. Worse, they were desperately attempting to forge my personal digital signature to finalize the transaction. I threw the car into gear and sped out of the clinic's parking lot. The sun was fully up now, painting the morning sky in vibrant shades of orange and gold. But inside my world, it had never felt colder or darker. My mind was racing even faster than the engine. Whoever was sitting at that computer terminal, trying to force this massive wire transfer through the Vance system, was clearly running out of time and getting reckless. They were trying to bypass the primary authentication protocols by using a forged credential package that perfectly mimicked my digital footprint. I didn't drive to corporate headquarters. Confronting Marcus Thorne, or whoever else was behind that desk right now, would only give them a chance to completely wipe the servers and destroy the logs before I could secure the digital evidence. Instead, I drove straight back to my large, empty house, a place that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. I bypassed the kitchen, walked down the long hallway to my private home office, locked the heavy door behind me, and pulled the thick wooden blinds shut, plunging the room into shadow. I turned on the desk lamp and sat down at my completely secure home terminal. 15 years ago, when Vance Realty was expanding aggressively and we were fending off corporate espionage from rival firms, I had hired an incredibly talented independent programmer to build a failsafe into our network architecture. It was a digital ghost, a completely invisible backdoor, written directly into the core framework of the company's servers. I never told Eleanor about it, and I certainly never told Julian or the board of directors. It was my ultimate insurance policy, designed for a catastrophic scenario, exactly like the one unfolding right now. I booted up the terminal and entered a complex sequence of command codes that hadn't been used in 10 years. The screen flickered black, and then lines of green code began cascading down like a waterfall. I was in. I moved through the hidden pathways of the network, silently slipping past the heavily praised corporate firewalls, without triggering a single alarm. Within moments, I locked onto the active terminal that had set off the security alert. The terminal was registered to the executive legal suite. Marcus Thorne was awake early and working overtime, frantically trying to push a heavily encrypted wire transfer through the system using a deceptive credential package designed to look exactly like my personal authorization. I monitored his keystrokes in real time, like a ghost watching a clumsy thief try to pick a lock. Marcus was a smooth, calculating corporate veteran when it came to legal mergers, but his understanding of deep network architecture was arrogant and fundamentally flawed. He had set up a series of internal locks to block standard accounting staff and my regular administrator access, but his walls were only built on the surface. He had no idea I was swimming right beneath the foundation of his digital fortress. With a few precise keystrokes, I isolated his transfer request and quietly quarantined the transaction, leaving that $6 million hanging in a hidden digital limbo. He could neither complete the transfer nor erase the digital footprint of his attempted theft. I had him perfectly cornered. My heart was pounding with a mix of pure rage and hyper-focus as I prepared to dig even deeper into the system. I needed to see exactly how long this rot had been spreading through my company, and I needed to gather every single scrap of unassailable evidence before they realized they had been caught. After blocking the immediate financial hemorrhage, I turned my attention to the root of the corruption. I needed to know just how deep this infection went. I tracked the destination of the intercepted wire transfer, following the complex routing numbers through a dizzying maze of offshore agreements and disguised corporate entities. What I uncovered was a highly sophisticated, deeply organized web of financial fraud. Marcus wasn't just skimming a little off the top, he had meticulously designed a massive pipeline meant to bleed my company dry. I discovered 4 different shell companies, all recently registered in Delaware under fake LLC names. Their names were generic, meaningless phrases designed to blend perfectly into standard project expense reports. Peak Construction Solutions, Apex Property Consulting, Horizon Management Partners, and Zenith Supply Chain Associates. I opened the accounting ledgers tied to these ghost operations. The digital paper trail revealed an endless stream of fabricated invoices, ghost consulting services for structural upgrades that never happened, non-existent software licensing, and fake maintenance routes that the Vance Group had supposedly outsourced. The volume of these fake invoices was staggering, but they were carefully calculated, with amounts sliding just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic secondary review by the board of directors. Marcus had precisely timed and structured these payments to look exactly like standard operating expenses for ongoing projects, hiding the theft perfectly behind a wall of tedious corporate bureaucracy. I began downloading every ledger, every fake invoice, and every routing number onto my secure hard drive, ensuring I had a permanent, unalterable record of their massive criminal enterprise. The depth of the deception was sickening. It revealed a cold, calculated greed that shattered any remaining illusions I held about the people running things at my own corporate headquarters. I kept digging, cross-referencing the dates of the fake invoices with the dates of the company's capital outflows. I pulled up the main corporate ledger and matched the missing funds against our internal accounts. When the numbers finally lined up on the glowing screen, a wave of intense nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the desk just to keep myself upright. This money wasn't coming from our daily operating revenue. It wasn't coming from our expansion reserves either. Over the past 8 months, the $6 million that Marcus and Claire had systematically siphoned off was pulled directly from escrow accounts, reserved for a pending $40 million downtown commercial building deal and the long-standing major repair funds meant for our properties. They had even dipped into a portion of the supplemental pension plans, reserved for our senior staff. These bastards were stealing the life savings of truck drivers, property managers, and maintenance coordinators, the very people who had stood by me and fought to build this company from nothing. And the absolute worst part was the timeline. I stared at the dates of the largest outgoing wire transfers, feeling a sharp, twisting pain in my chest. The very first massive withdrawal had been initiated 8 months ago. That was the exact same week Eleanor and I received the medical notice that her Alzheimer's had accelerated into a major stroke. While I was pacing the floors of a sterile neurology waiting room, holding my dying wife's fragile hand and crying at her bedside, my daughter-in-law and my chief legal officer were busy looting the company treasury. 他们知道我完全被悲痛和医疗决定分散了注意力。他们知道我的心思全都不在我看的比生命换重的女人身上。他们把我的痛苦武器化了，把埃莉诺悲惨的衰退当成了一个绝佳的、长期存在的挡箭牌，用来策划他们的大规模盗窃。克莱尔每一次去按住了胡中心探望，他脑子里盘算的都是还能再投多少钱，那些钱最后都变成了以他名义在加州哪怕孤买下的豪华葡萄庄园的砖瓦。我靠在沉重的皮椅背上，电脑显示器的光芒着亮了昏暗的房间，拼图的碎片终于以一种令人毛骨悚然的清晰毒品合在了一起。托管账户和养老金的巨额贪污，特拉华州的架空壳公司，黎明时分绝望的试图用我伪造的数字签名强行转账的举动，以及在艾莉诺葬礼仅仅4天后就突然极具攻击性的逼我签署继承协议。我拉开公文包，拿出了克莱尔昨天种种摔在我厨房琉璃台上的那个厚厚的牛皮指纹件夹，晋级信托节关于资产继承协议。我翻过了前面几页关于行政权力的法律注语，直接跳到了埋藏在这份冗长文件最末尾的最终条款。它就在那里，隐藏在一层又一层密不透风的企业法律注语之下，一份全面的赔偿豁免条款，完全免除信任制行动，是会之前发生的任何财务差异，以及一份授权季将来临的年终审计的强制性授权书。而作为唯一授权人的签字栏上需要的是我的名字。这份移交文件从来都不是为了夺取权利，它从来都不是因为克莱尔想在幕后统治公司。这份文件是一个经过精心打造的法律盾牌。年终企业审计计划在不到3周后开始，独立的审计公司会撕开公司的账簿，他们连1个小时都不用，就会发现托管账户和员工基金里有一个高达600万美元的巨大黑洞。当联邦调查人员不可避免地介入，并在废墟中搜寻证据时，他们会要求得到答案。他们会查看数字授权日志，他们会看到伪造凭证上有着我的数字签名。如果我签署了这份移交文件，我将在法律上认证权利移交之前的所有财务操作合法。克莱尔和马库斯不仅仅是在投我的钱，他们正在精心布局，让我为整个行动背黑锅。他们打算用我的签名，把这笔巨额贪污案彻底埋在我的名下。他们需要我的签名来钉死我的棺材，并且他们毫不犹豫地利用我的悲伤来达到目的。可惜，他们严重地估了他们正试图摧毁的这个男人。在摩斯地产集团数字阴影中发现真相之后的几个小时里，时间拖得令人窒息的漫长。我瘫痪了马库斯·索恩绝望中专以那600万美元的企图，将窃取的资金冻结在了一个虚无的空间里。但那只是金融战场，生物学战争仍在无声地进行着，等待科学给出无可辩驳的判决。我把自己锁在昏暗的家庭办公室里整整2天。我无视了朱利安打来的无休止的电话，他对我迟迟不签书籍称协议感到越来越焦虑。我无视了克莱尔发来的咄咄逼人的短信，他正在奇怪 为什么他不下完美的陷阱，还没有怕第一声合唱？我需要保持绝对的沉默，在拼图的每一块都被牢牢锁定在正确位置之前，现在做出任何反应都将是一个在男性的站着错误。我喝着枯涩的黑咖啡，撑着墙壁，我的大脑将这种背叛分割成可控的、克制性的步骤。终于，在第3天早上，放在我桌子上的内部安全备用手机剧烈地震动了起来，是一个本地号码，那个我在夜幕烟雾下摆放过的私人基因实验室。我立刻接通了电话，声音极其平稳，不带一丝人类的情感。摩斯先生，扬声器里传来一个毫无感情的专业声音：我们已经完成了您提供的生物样本的加急分析，全面的结果已经汇编、核实并密封，他们已准备好，您可以立刻在前台去走实体文件。我没有在电话里询问结果，我必须把那份实体文件亲手握在手里。我想记着冤倒了谢，挂断电话，抓起我厚重的羊毛大衣，彻底钉死我那个腐烂家庭的最后一根钉子正在等着我。早晨刺眼的阳光让开车前往私人诊所的路途感觉截然不同。当3天前的深夜，我开着同一条路线时，我还是一个被绝望、狂躁的怀疑所驱使的男人。而现在，我是一个正打不卖、相不可避免之私性质刑长的行星人。我把林肯领航员停在诊所，那没有标识的停车场里，踏入清冷的秋风中。大厅里冷酷击败的墙壁提供不了任何安慰。我走到接待台，提供了技术员分配给我塑了带的匿名数字条形吗？ Claire's eyes widened with unadulterated greed. The trap was snapping shut exactly as she had designed. She leaned forward, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of my mahogany desk. We will have the documents finalized and ready for your signature at the transition dinner on Friday night, she promised, her voice tight with barely suppressed excitement. We can execute the transfer formally in front of the entire executive committee and the private bank board. It will be a smooth, seamless handover of power. Julian smiled, a cowardly look of pure relief washing over his pale face. Thank you, Dad. This is the right decision. We promise to make you proud. I let them stay for another 20 minutes, enduring their fake sympathy and transparent, comforting words. They talked about the future of the company and the small operational changes they planned to implement, carefully avoiding any mention of the $6 million black hole they had blown through the employee funds. They were so utterly convinced of their own cleverness, so certain they had successfully manipulated a grieving old man, that they missed the absolute predatory stillness lurking beneath my trembling facade. They thought they were looking at a dying king surrendering his crown, with absolutely no idea they were looking at an executioner sharpening his blade. Finally, they rose to leave, completely eager to lock in their treacherous legal documents. I dragged myself to the front door with slow, defeated steps to see them out. Julian hugged me again, whispering empty promises of family support into my ear, while Claire gave me a stiff, formal embrace, her mind clearly already at Friday night's high-profile dinner. I watched them walk down the stone steps and climb into their expensive luxury SUV, a vehicle paid for entirely by my hard work. Wrapped in the freezing night wind, I stood on the porch and watched their red taillights disappear down the dark, winding street. The moment their car vanished from sight, the fragile, trembling old man disappeared instantly. I stood up straight, my shoulders squaring and my spine aligning like solid steel. The fake tremor in my hands vanished, replaced by rock-solid stability. I walked back inside, and the heavy oak door shut behind me with a decisive final thud. I strode through the hallway, the dim, melancholy lighting no longer affecting me. Returning to the study, I flipped on the bright overhead lights and picked up my secure backup phone. Without a single hesitation, I dialed a number I had memorized decades ago. The phone rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. "This is Evelyn Reed." Evelyn was my fiercely trusted personal, financial, and estate execution attorney. At 55, she was a brilliant, ruthless legal shark who had spent her entire career tearing rival corporations to shreds in brutal courtroom battles. She was a woman who knew true power was wielded not with a smile, but with a razor-sharp legal scalpel. "Evelyn," I began, my voice completely discarding the exhausted facade, returning to the cold, commanding tone of the executive who built the Vance Realty Group. "Clear the rest of your schedule for the week. I need you to draft a comprehensive termination and disinheritance dossier. We are dealing with systematic bad faith, massive financial fraud, and a definitive violation of Eleanor Vance's bloodline clause." There was a brief, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Evelyn didn't ask any stupid questions. She knew that tone, and she knew exactly what it meant. "Who are the targets, Arthur?" she asked, her voice completely shedding human emotion as she shifted into a cold, tactical mindset. "My son Julian," I replied, my voice steady as a rock, "my daughter-in-law Claire, and Marcus Thorne." I paused, letting the names land heavily in the digital connection. "They are attempting a hostile takeover disguised as an emergency inheritance, and they intend to use my signature to cover up $6 million in stolen funds. They want to finalize the handover this Friday night at the downtown private club dinner." Evelyn let out a low, dry chuckle that held absolutely no humor. "They certainly are ambitious. What are your specific instructions?" I stared at the framed photograph of Eleanor on my desk. Her radiant smile seemed to urge me forward, demanding absolute justice for the integrity of the legacy she had helped build. "Prepare all corporate audit trails, Evelyn. Connect with your federal contacts regarding the embezzlement, and bring the ironclad proof of the biological fraud." I leaned closer to the phone, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "We let them sit comfortably at the head table on Friday night. We let them believe they have won everything. And then, Evelyn, we dismantle them completely. It's time for a clearing of the house." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in human hubris. Believing they had successfully neutralized their last and greatest obstacle, Claire and Marcus abandoned all caution. Their arrogance became a blinding, intoxicating poison. Before the ink was even dry on the inheritance paperwork, they immediately began systematically purging anyone within Vance Realty Group who might question their new authority. By Wednesday afternoon, I received a phone call from Thomas Sterling, his voice filled with panic and confusion. Thomas was my fiercely loyal vice president of operations, a man who had stood by me for 20 years. He told me that Marcus had just walked into his office accompanied by corporate security, handing him a severance package under the guise of an emergency executive restructuring. Thomas wasn't the only casualty. Within less than 24 hours, they also abruptly terminated my financial controller and my chief property coordinator, replacing all 3 veteran pillars with unqualified, hand-picked yes-men. These new hires were nothing more than compliant rubber stamps, explicitly brought in to look the other way while the accounts were drained. And Julian, the supposed heir apparent, did absolutely nothing to stop the corporate slaughter. He simply hid in his pristine corner office, signing every termination authorization his wife pushed across his desk without asking a single question. I told Thomas to take his severance quietly, pack his personal items without causing a scene, and go on a brief, relaxing vacation. I assured him, in a voice that brooked no argument, that he would be sitting back in his chair by Monday morning. Trusting me completely, he walked out of the building with his head held high. Throughout Thursday morning, I wandered the halls of my own company like an invisible ghost, playing the part of the grieving, departing founder, saying a final farewell to his life's work. I walked slowly with slumped shoulders, letting the staff see the broken man the rumors had described. Near noon, I shuffled into my private corner office. The heavy wooden doors were propped open, and 2 interior designers with digital tape measures were already assessing the room's dimensions. Claire stood right in the center, gesturing toward the dark mahogany paneling and loudly demanding it be painted a cold, sterile white. She was already measuring space for imported Italian furniture, attempting to completely erase the history embedded in those walls. I stood silently in the doorway, watching her dismissively wave a hand to have a solid oak desk removed. That wasn't just a piece of furniture. 30 years ago, at that exact spot, Eleanor and I had sat side by side, drinking cheap champagne out of paper cups after signing our very first $1 million commercial development contract. We had held each other and cried that night, knowing that the desperate, exhausting struggles to establish this company had finally secured a permanent future for our family. Claire noticed me standing there and offered a brief, condescending smile. She told me not to worry, assuring me that they would be very careful when packing my personal belongings into cardboard boxes later that evening. I simply nodded, thanking her for her immense consideration, and turned away. As I walked down the corridor, I felt no anger at the desecration of my sanctuary. I felt only a deep, chilling anticipation. While Claire was busy selecting expensive fabric swatches for her stolen throne, Evelyn Reed and I were operating in the deep, invisible undercurrents of the corporate underworld. We transformed my home study into a highly secure, encrypted war room. Evelyn moved with the ruthless, terrifying efficiency of an apex predator that smelled blood in the water. Using a secure server, she directly contacted Agent Harrison, a highly decorated veteran of the FBI's white-collar crime division, along with the director of criminal investigation at the IRS. Harrison was someone Evelyn had clashed with in court years ago, but they shared a mutual, uncompromising respect for irrefutable hard evidence. We handed over the digital keys to the invisible back door within the Vance Realty Group servers. We gave federal agents absolute, unrestricted access to the maze of financial corruption. They spent the entirety of Wednesday night and Thursday tracing every digital paper trail we had painstakingly flagged. They monitored in real time as Marcus and Claire systematically drained the remaining trust and contingency funds through those 4 fake Delaware corporations. They verified the forged digital signatures, mapped out the offshore routing agreements, and secured federal warrants to freeze their illicit accounts in the Cayman Islands. The trap was no longer a simple corporate firing. It was a massive, fully coordinated federal sting. Agent Harrison personally assured Evelyn that armed tactical teams would be quietly positioned around the private club building before the dinner even commenced. The evidence of the $6 million embezzlement was absolute, and the federal government was eager to collect its prize. Friday's sun finally rose, washing the city in a crisp, bright, and unforgiving light. I stood in the center of my master bedroom, listening to the absolute silence of the house. The time for playing the grieving, broken old man was officially over. The performance had served its purpose, lulling my enemies into a false, intoxicating sense of absolute security. I walked to my expansive walk-in closet, bypassing the dark, conservative morning clothes I had worn for the past week. Instead, I pulled out a perfectly tailored, sharp-lapelled, charcoal gray suit. It was the armor of a corporate titan, the garment I wore only when I intended to completely dismantle my heaviest commercial competitors. I dressed slowly with absolute precision. I buttoned the crisp white shirt, fastened the heavy platinum cufflinks, and tied a flawless Windsor knot with a deep crimson silk tie. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The slouched, trembling widower was entirely gone. Staring back at me was the founder of the Vance Realty Group, a man who had survived economic collapses, cutthroat rivals, and the profound tragedy of losing his beloved wife. I walked over to the solid wood nightstand where Eleanor's favorite pearl necklace rested. I touched the cool pearls, drawing strength from her enduring memory. My focus was absolute, and my purpose was entirely unshakable. I wasn't just protecting a fortune. I was defending the sacred integrity of the woman who had sacrificed everything to build this empire alongside me. And tonight, justice would be served. I turned and left the quiet bedroom, striding down the grand staircase as my footsteps echoed across the polished hardwood floor with a commanding, authoritative rhythm. I stepped into the dimly lit study, the exact room where, just a few nights ago, Claire and Julian had foolishly believed they had broken me. The atmosphere in the room felt completely different now. The heavy shadows that had once concealed my carefully rehearsed vulnerability now seemed to embrace my impending retribution. Reaching into the hidden compartment of my mahogany desk, I pulled out the thick, tamper-proof envelope containing the report from the genetics lab. That crisp, white document held the absolute scientific truth regarding Chloe and her biological father, the ultimate weapon that would permanently sever their wrongful claims to my empire. I folded the document carefully, sliding it smoothly into the inside breast pocket of my suit jacket, keeping it pressed tight against my chest. I fastened my heavy silver watch onto my wrist and checked the time. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. The dinner was set to begin in 2 hours. Federal agents were currently moving into their designated positions. The legal paperwork for immediate termination had been completely finalized, sitting securely inside Evelyn's briefcase. The intricate chessboard was perfectly arranged, and my arrogant opponents were blindly pushing their king directly into a fatal, inescapable trap. I walked out the front door, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs with a sharp, exhilarating sense of clarity. I climbed into the driver's seat of my Lincoln Navigator, gripped the thick leather steering wheel, and turned the heavy ignition key. I was going to walk into that private clubroom and let them sit comfortably at the head of the long mahogany table. I would let them look down on me, fully believing they had won this brutal war. I would allow them to enjoy those brief, fleeting minutes of glorious, unadulterated triumph. And then I would completely torch their stolen world, leaving absolutely nothing behind without a single shred of mercy. I threw the heavy SUV into gear and pulled out of my quiet suburban driveway, watching the fading light of the sunset reflect sharply across the clean windshield. Today was not a day for mourning. Today marked the arrival of an absolute reckoning. The wicked had enjoyed their brief, unchecked reign, but now the true master was back. The drive toward the Union League Club in downtown Chicago blurred into a familiar pattern of streets and evening traffic. My mind was completely locked on the impending execution. I left the car with the valet and stepped into the biting night air. I walked through the club's heavy brass revolving doors, my posture perfectly upright, the expensive fabric of my custom suit fitting my shoulders flawlessly. The security guards and front desk receptionists, who had watched me shuffle past like a defeated old man for the last 2 days, stared in shock. The fragile, trembling widower was completely gone. I walked confidently toward the elevator leading directly to the top-floor private dining room, my hard leather shoes clicking a rhythmic tempo against the polished marble floor. Every step was a deliberate strike against the false reality my enemies had constructed. I pressed the button for the top floor and watched the numbers climb, carrying me directly toward the absolute climax of this corporate war. When I arrived, the heavy mahogany doors to the main banquet room were shut. I didn't bother knocking. I simply pushed them open and strode into the expansive suite. The room was packed. Claire had meticulously arranged an impressive, dramatic audience to witness her grand moment of victory. She sat squarely at the very head of the long, polished dining table, occupying the high-backed leather chair that had belonged to me for 30 years. Seated immediately to her right was my son Julian, looking pale under his expensive designer suit and sweating slightly. To her left was Chief Legal Officer Marcus Thorne, wearing a smug, triumphant grin that made my stomach turn. Sitting next to Marcus was 19-year-old Chloe, aimlessly scrolling through her smartphone, entirely oblivious to the massive criminal conspiracy swirling around her. The rest of the long table was filled with the newly appointed sycophantic executives Marcus had rushed to hire to replace my loyal veterans. They looked at me with expressions mixed with pity and arrogant condescension, fully believing they were about to witness the pathetic, final surrender of a dying king. I walked slowly toward the only remaining empty chair at the far end of the massive table. I never broke eye contact with Claire. I took my seat, placing my hands flat on the cold, polished wood. The room fell into a dead silence. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Claire leaned forward, intertwining her manicured fingers and resting her elbows directly on the table. She practically radiated pure, unadulterated greed and triumph. She gestured to one of the new executives, who quickly and frantically slid a thick manila folder down the length of the table. The folder slid smoothly across the polished mahogany, coming to a gentle stop directly in front of me. Sitting right on top of the legal documents was an incredibly expensive heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. "This is the final emergency trust takeover and asset succession agreement," Claire announced, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. Her tone was sharp and commanding, completely discarding the fake, sweet sympathy she had used in my study days ago. "The smooth transition of executive power has been fully approved by the new board members present here today. We have streamlined the legal process to ensure that all corporate assets, property titles, and operational control transfer rapidly and seamlessly to the family trust. All we need now is your final authorizing signature on the dotted line." I looked down at the thick stack of paperwork. Buried deep within those pages was the exact liability, waiver, and mandatory audit authorization that would legally pin the blame for the stolen $6 million from the escrow accounts and pension funds squarely on me. I looked back up at Claire. She was no longer pretending to be a supportive family member. She was a predator convinced her jaws were locked around my throat. The mask was completely off. She leaned back in my leather chair, a cruel, mocking smile spreading slowly across her face. "Since the old lady is gone," Claire said, her voice dripping with absolute venom and clear malice, "you're going to transfer the company trust assets to my daughter right now, and then you can take your pension and live out the rest of your days in Florida. Your time is over, Arthur. It's our turn to steer the ship." The sheer cruelty of her words hung heavily in the stagnant air of the room. She had finally spoken the absolute truth, exposing the dark, rotting core beneath her 20-year deception. The newly hired executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, slightly unsettled by her blatant coldness, but they remained completely silent, keeping their unwavering loyalty to their corrupt new employer. Marcus Thorne let out a low chuckle, adjusting his silk tie with a gesture of pure arrogance. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, somewhat confused by the sudden tension, but quickly turned her attention back to the glowing screen. I offered no reaction to her malicious words about my late wife. My face remained an impenetrable, freezing mask of stone. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the legal folder. The polished metal felt cool and solid against my fingers. I held it loosely, letting the bright light from the overhead chandelier reflect off the gold barrel. I turned my head and looked directly at Julian. This was the absolute, final threshold. He was a cowardly man who had actively participated in a massive, systematic fraud just to protect an unearned inheritance. He had sat by and watched his wife insult the memory of his recently deceased mother, but he was still my son. I stared hard into his anxious, sweating face, offering one last silent plea. I gave him a single, fleeting opportunity to stand up like a man and halt this madness before the federal hammer completely shattered his entire existence. I waited, suspending the gold pen in the quiet air. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving violently against his tight collar. He saw the intense, piercing question in my eyes. He knew exactly what I was silently demanding him to do. In that agonizingly brief moment, I saw a flicker of genuine hesitation cross his pale face. But cowardice was rooted too deeply in his soul. The overwhelming terror of losing his luxury lifestyle completely crushed whatever remaining shred of basic human decency he had left. Julian actively chose his own destruction. He looked away, turning his head to stare blindly at his polished leather shoes. The betrayal was absolute. I slowly opened my fingers, releasing my grip on the gold pen. The metal cylinder dropped onto the mahogany tabletop with a sharp click that echoed loudly through the dead silent boardroom. I leaned back into my chair comfortably, folding my hands over my lap. I looked straight into Claire's expectant, incredibly arrogant eyes. "No," I said smoothly. Before her brain could even begin to process the meaning of my absolute refusal, the heavy double doors of the private dining room were violently pushed open. Evelyn Reed strode into the room. Flanking her on both sides were two cold-faced federal agents dressed in dark trench coats. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly to an absolute freezing point. Evelyn didn't stop for pleasantries. She didn't introduce the tall FBI agents walking seamlessly into the room behind her, whose dark trench coats formed a stark, incredibly jarring contrast against the luxurious corporate surroundings. She marched with the precise, calculated steps of a seasoned executioner approaching the gallows. The arrogant, victorious smile that had just been plastered across the faces of the new executives vanished instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating wave of collective confusion. Evelyn completely ignored the row of empty chairs. She walked straight to the very head of the long, polished mahogany table, stopping just a few feet away from the leather chair Claire occupied. She unbuckled the clasp of her sleek black leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic click violently cut through the shocked, suffocating silence of the room. Reaching inside, she slowly drew out the thick, tamper-proof envelope containing the verified genetics lab report. With a smooth, practiced flick of her wrist, she tossed the critical document onto the center of the pristine tabletop. It slid evenly across the reflective surface, coming to a sudden halt directly between Claire and Julian. The plain white paper looked entirely ordinary, but it held a massive scientific truth that was about to brutally shatter their entire stolen reality. Evelyn buttoned her tailored suit jacket, her expression an impenetrable mask of absolute, uncompromising legal authority. In that completely stunned room, before anyone could even gasp or ask a question, Evelyn spoke. Her voice carried a resonant power that immediately commanded the room, leaving absolutely no room for any cowardly interruptions. I represent Mr. Arthur Vance in all legal matters concerning the execution of the Eleanor Vance Trust and corporate succession for Vance Realty Group, she announced loudly, her cold gaze staring directly down at Claire. The sealed document I have just placed before you is a legally binding, independently verified genetic analysis. Less than 48 hours ago, it was processed under extreme rush priority and officially certified by a top-tier independent medical laboratory. Evelyn didn't wait for them to reach out with trembling hands to open it. She recited the devastating scientific conclusion completely from memory, her pronunciation flawlessly clear, carrying a tone of deliberate punishment. The biological samples analyzed yielded a probability of paternity of exactly 0%. The subject currently known as Chloe Vance is decisively and permanently excluded as the biological offspring of Julian Vance. Those heavy words slammed into the stagnant air of the suite. Like a physical shockwave, a deep, terrified gasp echoed loudly from the other side of the massive table. Looking past Marcus, I saw 19-year-old Chloe go completely rigid. Slumping back into her leather chair, she finally dropped her prized smartphone onto the table. Every ounce of healthy color vanished from her young face in an instant, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent pale. She turned her head slowly, looking straight at her mother with wide, completely overwhelmed eyes, silently begging her to deny the impossible accusation. But Claire didn't even turn to look at her heartbroken daughter. Her arrogant, carefully constructed smirk had been violently shattered into a mask of pure, absolute, and undeniable panic. The confident, ruthless predator who had ordered me to take my pension and disappear just moments ago was instantly replaced by a cornered, pathetic, and desperate animal. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her perfectly manicured hands hovering uselessly above the white envelope, trembling violently. She knew she was completely caught, but her deceptive mind was still frantically trying to calculate a miracle path out of a perfect trap. Sitting right beside her, Marcus Thorne suddenly felt the crushing, suffocating weight of his new reality. The smug, triumphantly arrogant sneer was completely wiped from his sweating face. He clearly recognized the undeniable presence of the federal agents, and his deep knowledge of financial and criminal law told him exactly what was happening to his grand scheme. Placing his palms flat on the mahogany table, he desperately tried to push his heavy chair back, instinctively wanting to flee the enclosed room, or make a mad dash back to his private office to wipe the digital evidence from the servers. He had barely stood up halfway when one of the tall FBI agents moved with terrifying speed. The agent stepped forward instantly, slamming a massive, heavy hand onto Marcus's expensive shoulder, forcing the corrupt chief legal officer back down into his leather chair with painful force. "Do not attempt to stand up, sir," the agent ordered sternly, his voice a low, gravelly threat that made it clear any defiance of a direct command would bring immediate physical consequences. Evelyn Reed didn't even look at the struggling lawyer. She locked her freezing, steel-hard gaze entirely on Claire, delivering an unyielding punishment under the incredibly strict, uncompromising, and legally binding terms of the trust established by the late Eleanor Vance. Evelyn explained smoothly, her powerful voice cutting effortlessly through the rising panic in the room. Any lawful transfer of massive corporate assets, executive operational control, or extensive financial holdings is strictly, exclusively, and permanently tied to a direct biological descendant of the Vance bloodline. There are absolutely no exceptions, no hidden legal loopholes to exploit, and certainly no alternative interpretation of the foundational family trust documents. Evelyn took a deliberate step closer to the table, leaning forward slightly to ensure every single word she spoke carried the full, devastating weight of the American legal system. Because you actively and maliciously engaged in a massive, systematic biological fraud designed to falsely present this young woman as a legitimate heir, the emergency trust, takeover, and asset succession agreement currently sitting on this table is completely null and void. The entire corporate transfer is legally terminated, effective immediately. You hold no legal standing in this company. You possess zero executive operational power, and you have absolutely no valid claim to a single penny of the massive Vance fortune. You are entirely stripped of all corporate and family authority, right here, right now. Evelyn's execution of the legal checkmate was flawless, leaving absolutely no room for escape. Following her declaration, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Then Julian snapped out of his chair like a man hit by a massive electric shock. A dramatic mask of rage twisted his pale face. His voice cracking with a forced display of betrayal, he pointed a shaking finger at his terrified wife, his eyes wide with exaggerated disbelief. "How could you do this to me, Claire?" he yelled frantically. "You had me raise another man's child. You used me to steal from my own family." He was desperately trying to convince the cold federal agents, and me, that he was entirely innocent of the massive fraud. Turning to me, he held his hands up in a pathetic gesture of pleading surrender, forced tears welling in his cowardly eyes. But I simply bent down and unbuckled the heavy brass clasps on my leather briefcase. I had absolutely no intention of letting him off the hook. I pulled open the leather flap of the briefcase, the sound of the brass buckles popping, echoing sharply in the quiet room. Julian remained standing opposite me, hands raised, continuing his dramatic performance of destroyed innocence. He closed his eyes tightly, forcing pathetic tears down his pale cheeks, waiting for me to comfort him. He was waiting for his grieving father to rush forward and embrace his poor, deceived son. I didn't move toward him. Instead, I reached deep into the briefcase and pulled out the thick personnel dossier David Sterling had handed to me in that grimy roadside diner. Marcus stood beside her, a hollow, defeated shell of the smooth legal executive he used to be. They were led out of the courtroom in heavy chains, permanently exiled from the lavish world they had tried to steal from me. And my son Julian faced a very different but equally crushing kind of prison. After being completely severed from the immense Vance fortune and abruptly stripped of the luxurious lifestyle he had grown so accustomed to, he experienced a brutal, unforgiving fall back to reality. I hired an independent private investigator to check on him just once, solely to ensure that the legal procedures of his eviction and disinheritance had been carried out completely. The report was deeply pathetic, but for a man who sold out his mother's honor for a comfortable allowance, it was absolute justice. Julian now lives in a crowded, noisy, low-rent apartment complex on the edge of the city. To barely make ends meet, he works an exhausting minimum-wage retail job at a large local home improvement center. He spends his days wearing a cheap polyester work vest, taking orders from managers half his age, and lifting heavy stock onto shelves for a meager hourly wage. He is finally being forced to learn the true value of a dollar earned through honest sweat, the exact lesson Eleanor and I had tried so desperately to teach him decades ago. I feel not a single shred of pity for his current misery. He is simply harvesting the barren fruit of the deception he willingly chose to plant. While the architects of my destruction face their harsh new realities, I focused all of my energy on repairing the severe damage they had caused to my life's work. The recovery of Vance Realty Group was no simple task, but I approached it with the same uncompromising, powerful drive that helped me turn a single rundown duplex into an empire decades ago. My very first executive order was to personally contact Thomas Sterling and the other fiercely loyal executives who had been abruptly fired during Claire's brief, arrogant reign of terror. I invited them back to corporate headquarters, restored them to their original positions, provided them with substantial financial bonuses, and offered my most sincere, heartfelt apology for the chaotic disruption they had endured. They returned without a single hesitation. They stepped seamlessly back into their roles and helped me fully stabilize the ship. We worked tirelessly side by side with Agent Harrison and the federal investigative team, navigating the complex maze of offshore accounts to track down every single dollar. The process was tedious and incredibly complicated, but Evelyn Reed's brilliant legal maneuvering ensured that the funds frozen in the Cayman Islands were rapidly returned to American shores. The $6 million that Marcus and Claire had maliciously siphoned off was successfully recovered in full. I personally supervised the transfer of those funds directly back into the employee repair and pension accounts. I made absolutely certain that the hard-working men and women who formed the true backbone of Vance Realty Group would not lose a single fraction of their rightful retirement security. On the morning the funds were fully restored, I called a company-wide meeting. Standing before hundreds of my dedicated employees, I assured them that the storm had officially passed and that their futures were completely secure. Looking out at the sea of relieved faces, I felt the heavy, suffocating darkness of the past 6 months finally begin to clear from my shoulders. The rot had been aggressively and permanently excised, and the healing process was well underway. However, the final restructuring and revival of my company required far more than just balancing financial ledgers and rehiring loyal staff. It demanded a deep, structural change to the very foundation of the Vance legacy. I needed to ensure that the massive greed that had poisoned my own family could never again threaten the grand empire Eleanor and I had sacrificed everything to create. On a crisp, cloudless Tuesday morning, I took the private elevator to the rooftop of the Vance Realty Group headquarters. The expansive terrace offered a stunning panoramic view of the entire city skyline, a vibrant, bustling metropolis where my construction trucks moved every single day. The freezing morning wind whipped aggressively against my tailored suit jacket, but I felt a deep, radiating warmth blooming steadily in my chest. Evelyn Reed stood quietly beside me. In her hands, she held a thick leather portfolio containing the finalized legal documents that would permanently reshape my massive wealth. I reached out and took the heavy gold pen she handed to me. I didn't hesitate. Placing the documents on a small glass table we had brought out to the terrace, I began signing my name with smooth, decisive strokes. I officially executed a brand new, ironclad trust agreement. 50% of my entire personal wealth and corporate holdings was instantly transferred to the newly established Eleanor Vance Alzheimer's Research and Scholarship Foundation. This massive charitable initiative was explicitly designed to provide full college scholarships and comprehensive living allowances to talented, underprivileged young people who possess the ambition to succeed, but lack the financial resources to achieve their dreams. Simultaneously, it would heavily fund cutting-edge research into degenerative brain diseases. Eleanor always believed deeply in the transformative power of education and the undeniable value of an honest, hard-working heart. This foundation would ensure her beautiful memory lives on forever, linking her name with profound generosity rather than the sickening greed of our former daughter-in-law. The remaining 50% of the company was irrevocably placed into an employee stock ownership plan. The vast fortune of Vance Realty Group would absolutely not be passed down to an entitled, ungrateful heir. It would be systematically distributed to the dedicated construction supervisors, the tired property managers, and the loyal executives who had actually bled and sweat alongside me to build this place. They are the true keepers of this empire, and they deserve to reap the rich rewards of their unwavering dedication. I stood at the edge of the high terrace, looking out over the endless expanse of the city. Family is never defined solely by blood, and certainly not by a simple marriage certificate. It is defined by absolute, unshakable loyalty. A lone wolf may lose his pack, but he never, ever loses his teeth. And I had just bitten back hard. The world slowly fades away, dissolving into a quiet, peaceful darkness. I used to ride on your shoulders, thinking I could touch the sky if I just reached out. When looking at the world through your eyes, no road ever seemed quite as lost. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. When the freezing winter winds howled, you always stood between them and me. Time moves forward like a rushing river, and you slowly sailed toward a distant sea. But no matter where life takes me, you will always be an inseparable part of who I am. I am my father's daughter. In every single step I take, in every choice I make when compromise is easier than standing tall, I carry your courage in my heart and your fire in my soul. Even as the years roll on, your love still guides my way home. You taught me that true strength lies not in wielding power, but in maintaining kindness when the world gets hard. You taught me how to keep moving forward when the path ahead turns cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, and every laugh shared around the hearth echoes deep within me, softly calling my name. When I face the toughest battles in life, when I feel like I can no longer hold on, I can hear your voice whispering in my ear, "Child, you are stronger than you know." I am my father's daughter. In every step and in every choice I make when giving up is easier than standing firm, I carry your courage in my heart and your fire in my soul. Though the wheels of time keep moving forward, your love still guides my way home. One day the heavy snow will cover all our footsteps. One day the fire in the hearth will dim. But what a father leaves to his daughter is a treasure that will never fade away. It is not glittering gold, or stories sung by crowds, or the battles he once won. It is the silent, steady way he loved her, and the woman who finally grew up under the shelter of that love. I am my father's daughter, and I will keep this heart forever. Through every victory and every loss, through every joy and every pain. The world around me may change completely, and the stars above may fade, but I will walk forward with my Father's endless love inside me. When they ask me who I am, I will smile and answer softly, I am my Father's daughter. I will always be my Father's daughter.